Now, to get more insight on this conflict, we go live now to human rights attorney Huwaida Arraf. Huwaida, thanks a lot for joining us on the program. The first question I have for you is basically about these brutal clashes that we've been seeing in several cities, especially in Lod and Bat Yam. And for several days straight, these clashes continue in Jerusalem as well. There's been a lot of fiery rhetoric on both sides. Who would you say is mainly to blame for all this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I wouldn't call them clashes because what is happening is Israel is using brutal force to maintain a settler colonial regime and its apartheid practices, which has for decades been oppressing Palestinians. This latest flare-up that we see is only, a symptom of decades of Palestinians being dispossessed, not allowed to return to their land, and in Israel actually engineering the population in order to maintain a Jewish population in Jerusalem and throughout Israel, and also trying to take over more and more Palestinian land. So we saw it in Sheikh Jarrah that your correspondent mentioned. Sheikh Jarrah, Israel actually is coming and taking Palestinian families and throwing them out of their homes so they can move white Jewish settler families into these homes. And then they brutalize protesters and allow Jewish supremacist demonstrators to march through these neighborhoods in a provocative way, waving their flags and chanting death to Arabs and other provocations. And so all Palestinians have been doing is demonstrating, and they get beaten up and arrested. Hamas obviously then threatened to launch rockets if Israel continues to do this, to brutalize people in Jerusalem and kick people out of their homes, and Israel continued to do it. And unfortunately, we see this escalation. But it should not be clashes. It should not be Israel is responding. Israel is using illegal force. We have 67 people dead already, including 15 children in Gaza because of the indiscriminate use of force and the deliberate targeting of civilian structures. And it's using this kind of force to maintain a settler colonial regime and apartheid practices which no one should condone. Nobody.
It's interesting you say that because earlier we saw reports that, for example, Washington has been preventing the United Nations from laying any blame on Israel for the recent eruption of violence. And we heard even Joe Biden say that Israel, quote, has a right to defend itself in this case. What do you make of this virtually unconditional support for Israel here? And why does Washington offer it in the first place?
Well, unfortunately, the United States is at the heart of this, because if it wasn't for unconditional United States support, not only to the tune of $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every single year, but also, as you mentioned, in preventing UN Security Council resolutions, any meaningful resolutions, from condemning Israel or proposing any kind of action to end Israel's actions. So the United States has been providing cover and has been giving Israel impunity. And when you have impunity to act, when you face no repercussions because you have the United States still funding you and protecting you from international condemnation, then you have no incentive to pull back, to even negotiate, or to give up your power. And this power, again, is in the form of a colonialist regime. Israel wants all of historic Palestine to be Jewish, and they're implementing policies to try to make that happen. What does that mean for the indigenous Palestinian population? They have almost no rights, and they're being systematically expelled and dispossessed from their land. And this is the nature of the struggle. For Palestinians, it's a liberation struggle. It's taken all forms historically, mainly nonviolent, but up against one of the most powerful militaries in the world, backed by a superpower that is unrelenting. And all we hear, as you mentioned, from Joe Biden is Israel has a right to defend itself, or at best, we want to see calm. If the United States really is serious about wanting to see calm, then it needs to tell Israel that it is going to be held accountable. The United States is not going to protect Israel anymore while it's committing these massive violations of Palestinian rights. And if the United States really is serious about, especially this administration, which came in talking about working with the international community, respecting human rights, restoring respect for the rule of law, then itself, the United States itself, needs to respect international law and stop aiding and abetting Israel's violations.
Well, I wanted to go back to something we spoke about earlier, the violence specifically in the city of Lod. We heard from the mayor there. He compared the violence that's going on there to a Jewish pogrom, basically, carried out by, quote, Arab thugs. So we've heard a lot of racially charged rhetoric, specifically from Israeli officials, Arabs versus Jews. But would you say that this conflict has racial tensions at its core, or is it something economic or political?
Well, unfortunately, Palestinians always say that before the state of Israel was created, we lived side by side. This is not a religious thing. This is not a racial or ethnic conflict. It is one about rights, about land, about a person's right to lead a life with dignity. And so when the state of Israel was created, it massively expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and brought in Jewish Europeans to take their place, and for 73 years has not allowed these Palestinians to return. Meanwhile, the Palestinians that managed to stay on their land and were not kicked out or killed have been struggling to stay on their land as Israel is expanding its hold and annexing more and more land. Now, with the extreme and I will say fascist rule that we have in Israel now, they are inflaming with the language that Netanyahu himself uses, inflames the racial element of this. But it's more prominent now because of the nature and how right-wing and extremist Israel's government has gotten. But historically, again, Israel and Israel's leaders have wanted to create this Jewish state by getting rid of the native Palestinian population. And when you use that kind of rhetoric and give privileges to the Jews over the Palestinians, you are building a society that sees these ethnic divisions. And when you poll Israeli citizens, unfortunately, the large majority of them believe that Palestinians and those of Arab origin do not have the same rights, need to leave. They don't want to live side by side with them. And so the comment that you mentioned of the Jewish pogrom and Arab thugs, it's just the opposite. It was the Arabs that are being lynched right now in the streets by armed Jewish fanatics. They're walking through the streets, pulling people out of their cars and beating them bloody, and chanting death to Arabs. And they're not being restrained by their government. And that's how it's doing. Palestinians are afraid for their lives.
Huwaida Arraf, human rights attorney, thank you very much for joining us on the program. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me.